Welcome back, everyone, for the afternoon session of the IPN Social Justice Conference. And welcome to all the virtual attendees. We're starting the 2 p.m. session on inclusive innovation and cutting-edge IP strategies. Moderating this panel will be Daryl Lim from Penn State Law School. I don't know where to start because I can say so much about him, but how I would summarize Daryl is he's an international IP scholar, but also a gentleman and really committed to teaching the next generation of IP leaders. He has been passionate about advancing DEI in the IP space, and just last week organized an international conference with WIPO and the PTO and Penn State leadership to explore issues that are so important in diversifying the profession in the international context.
And it was right here at Finnegan.
And in New York and in Texas. So he's really active in this space, both on the practical level as well as in the academia. It's a real pleasure to have an academic scholar and a leader in this space. I have particular fondness for Daryl Lim, not only because we share a common last name, but because we were brought together by a common mentor and dear friend, Don Dunner, just prior to the pandemic. And even though Don is here with us in spirit, I feel that his legacy continues to live on in our continued friendship. So thank you for being here, Daryl.
Thanks so much, Esther, for the kind introduction. It's an honor and privilege to be back and to support the important work that you and Latif started 21 years ago.
Thank you.
It's been a natural partnership, I think, largely because we both all believe in the importance of what we're about to discuss today. And we're so glad that we have a panel of distinguished speakers that we've brought together. And I'm going to introduce them as we go along so that we can dive right in to the session. And I should say also that another reason why we are natural partners is because my dean, Danielle Conway, started the Anti-Racist Development Institute, and Nancy, who is a contributor to that effort, is here with us today at Penn State Dickinson Law. And we hope that these kinds of institutional collaborations will continue and spread across the IP ecosystem. So we're going to focus on the issue of inclusive innovation and cutting-edge IP strategies. And I thought I'd invite Judge Paul Michel, who is a former Chief Judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. I should say, very proud that he is also the chair of our advisory board at our IP and Innovation Initiative at Penn State Dickinson Law, to give us an overview of what the landscape looks like from your perspective. Judge Michel.
Thank you, Daryl. It's a pleasure to be working with you and Latif Mtima and all of his allies and fans, especially on such an important topic. And it's very appropriate that Esther is here too, because she's been working on this for a little over 2 decades, if I've got the timing right. There are 2 people that I have found I can never say no to, and they both have the surname Lim. Well, the landscape, if you look at it from a positive standpoint, is shifting in a positive direction. Of course, it's never as fast as we would like, but the direction is important. A different way to look at it is that we need to be more creative in order to stock pipelines of many different kinds with more diverse talents, and to develop people at every level. As a former judge, I'm particularly focused on younger people who can become law clerks. And very important to have diverse judges, but it's equally important, I would submit, to have diverse law clerks and diversity in court staffs and support people throughout the whole judiciary. I think that as I say, that there's been some progress, but it's it's never what you kind of hope it will be in pace. It's a little bit like legislation. It matures all too slowly. I remember when I was still a rookie federal circuit judge in 1989, I hired a very distinguished young lawyer as a law clerk from Finnegan, actually. Named James Smith, and he later became very well known as first chief judge of the Patent Trial and Appeal Board, and for a very distinguished career with various law firms and corporations. He was the first African-American law clerk hired by any federal circuit judge. This is in 1989. And it's just shocking to me that that was the state of things that late in the calendar. So I think everybody has to do their part on an individual level. I think it's very easy to overrate court compulsion as a way to speed progress or force progress, because courts mean litigation. Litigation means big delays, big expense, big disruption. So I'm of the view that individual efforts by people in the judiciary and related institutions like the Patent Office or the Food and Drug Administration or NIST or others, Federal Trade Commission, International Trade Commission, all these institutions need to make efforts at all levels, and it works best if some leaders at the upper levels set an example, and then other people follow, and then the diversity that enlivens the quality and the humanity of these institutions increases. So I think we all have a responsibility to try to do what each of us can, planted wherever we are planted. I think that's the most productive pathway forward.
Judge Michel, I want to point out, especially for folks in this room who don't know about your connection with this program, and I hear this often from both Estée and Latif, that you were one of the early champions of what they have been trying to do over the last 20 years. And this was back before Latif even created the field, as was pointed to us in an earlier session. What prompted you to say, this is a cause which I want to put my name behind?
Well, that's a good question, and it's not so easy for me to answer. It was very instinctive. It was partly influenced by Estée, who I already knew a bit and admired. The same with Latif. And my colleague, Judge Richard Lynn, was an early adopter, as the cliche puts it. And that influenced me too, but it really was mainly just an intuitive sense. This is a worthy cause. This needs to happen. People have to jump in wherever they can. And one of the reasons why I have associated myself with, law schools other than, take your pick, Harvard or some other, super powerful, super prestigious, super rich institution. So I did a lot of teaching at lesser known law schools and found it very useful and enlivening and impressive. And I ended up hiring some law clerks from less famous law schools, not Ivy League or however we want to categorize it. So I've kind of had a instinctive interest in this going way back, and it's been very productive as well as satisfying at a personal level, because I've formed many good new friendships, including with Daryl Lim, because of the prior connection he had with the Chicago Law School that I had some connection with, did some teaching at. So I think people in leadership positions need to set an example, not just be as good as everybody else, but try to be more forward thinking, more take more initiative, and then hope it will trickle down. It doesn't always, but it tends to if you keep doing it.
Thanks. Great insights and a great segue actually to bring in the rest of the panel into this conversation. I'm going to ask all three of them. You notice all three of them, as I introduce them, are all corporate counsel, and it's by design. It's not coincidence. To my right, I have Desmond from under Armour, then Ankur Shah from Freddie Mac, and at the end, Idris McKelvey from Estée Lauder. The question for each of you is, what does inclusive innovation by design look like where you are?
Sure. So I think of three main points. I think that, and as you mentioned, so I'm in-house counsel for Under Armour, and I work on trademark, copyright, and advertising primarily, and strategy for those. And so inclusive innovation may look a little bit different than to my peers up here, but I think outside of just, we have an innovation org, right? And those are people with engineering backgrounds where you get most of the patentable ideas and that process, right? But I also think of innovation outside with our marketing org. What are they doing to diversify? And then I think there's two approaches, which we'll get into later. But I think it starts with intentionality as to what they're doing. You're not going to stumble upon diversifying both within your workforce, but then when you're looking at your target consumers, how you're innovating. Basically, to me, let me take it back a second. Innovating to me means, what problem are we trying to solve? And our marketing folks also can innovate, and they can think about how we have campaigns that are inclusive. Who are the talent that we're featuring in our global campaigns? What are our strategies here to diversify as well? So in intentionality, I think being nimble and humble, holding up a mirror to yourself, because I think oftentimes you're in a position where you're trying to problem solve for people that may not be yourself, and you need to get those insights before you're saying, this is the solution that will work for you. So there's that aspect too. And yeah, I have some examples that I do want to get into later, but I'll pause there.
Thank you. Thank you.
So you mentioned intentionality, and I had that as a point that I wanted to highlight as well. And you asked more specifically, what does inclusive innovation by design mean to us, mean to our companies? And I would, to be brutally honest, inclusive innovation by design sounds to me to be more of a marketing slogan, right? It's almost like an eye-rolling marketing slogan. If I were to present that to people in my company, okay, we're going to put out this program, inclusive innovation by design, it might be met with some, scant. However, the underlying premise, I think, is entirely accurate and appropriate. We want to make sure that we have diverse teams throughout the company, right? Not just in the R&D, not just in the product development, but throughout the company. We know that diversity makes us smarter. It makes us more innovative, sort of in all respects. It makes us, more profitable. Obviously, there's studies done about that. We know that, and there are people that may not agree with that, but we know that that is the case. It also, I think, in the creativity and enhancing creativity, having diversity in a team, it forces you to have more difficult conversations, and it gets you outside of your comfort zone, right? So, for example, if you're talking to people who are very similar to yourself with a similar background, and you talk about a certain idea or concept, and you can say something almost shorthand, well, you understand what I'm talking about, or you get that. And they'll nod along, yeah, they get that, they understand. So what does that do? That there's no testing of that theory, there's no testing of that idea. Everyone has just accepted it. However, when you have a more diverse group, and you have, and I talk to myself, actually, I force myself to do this, and I talk to my kids about doing this, is if you want to talk about a concept or a topic, and you think you know enough about it, then tell me about it. Explain it to me, someone who doesn't know anything about it. If you can explain that concept to someone who doesn't already know what you're talking about, that will test whether you've really deliberated about the nuances, whether you really understand what you're talking about.
You're talking about my other day job.
Oh, yeah?
as a law professor. Go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good tool to use, and I think it's a really useful tool then coming back to the product team. Having a diverse group in the product team where everyone doesn't automatically know what you're talking about or doesn't have the same background or experience to understand. You have to explain it to them. You have to be ready to convince them, right? And in that process, you as a team are going to come out with a much better solution, I think.
Great, thank you. Idris?
Thanks, sir. I'm Idris McKelvey. Thank you for the introduction. I also want to acknowledge that I'm also a Howard Law alum from 2005. So always a pleasure to come to this event. And I lead the global patent team at Estée Lauder. So what I want to talk about, though, and the way that I'd like to frame it is actually to go back a little bit in history. I mentioned at dinner the other night that I listened to a podcast where John Pepper and Ursula Burns were having a discussion on sort of their journeys. Ursula having been a former CEO at Xerox, and John Pepper was a longtime CEO at Procter & Gamble. His tenure started in 1963 at Procter & Gamble. Not a CEO, but that was day one. But as a manager, he was one of the first managers to hire a woman to come into the marketing department at Procter & Gamble, who largely at the time sold nothing but products to women. And including feminine products. So there were all these guys trying to solve those problems. And he, afterwards, in hindsight, it became obvious that you can't use hindsight in patent law, but it became obvious that that was a good decision, that you should have someone who experiences these problems, solving these problems. So, tying this to sort of a business case, as Suzanne often likes to mention, is what is the business case for inclusive innovation and diversity? I think that was a good sort of seminal moment for me to think about how to frame this. But in the 1960s, the other thing that was going on was the civil rights movement. The idea of Black is beautiful was one of these slogans that came out of that time, and it was considered radical. It was absolutely radical to say Black is beautiful in public space, which seems arcane, but we're in a place now where Black Lives Matter is treated the same way in certain environments, right? So we're not so far removed from that. So the intentionality that it takes to be able to work against that, really at the level of business strategy, and figure out not only what problems are you trying to solve, like Claire mentioned, which I think makes us a little bit more consistent than you might have thought, because I do think that that's what it comes down to, but also who's in the room trying to solve those problems. So if we're going to have a campaign around treating textured hair, maybe I shouldn't be in it, but someone who has textured hair should be part of that solution. And when you look at the maturity of organizations and the problems that they're trying to solve, something that they teach at B&G is this whole idea of innovation is driven by servicing these unmet consumer needs. But if you're servicing the same needs of the same people over and over and over and over, it's kind of like going to the same well, looking for new ideas with the same folks. It's going to get tapped out at some point in time. So then businesses start to realize that multicultural marketing is important. We're becoming more global. Our consumers look very different than they used to. And there's a business imperative around that. And that also means that in the hierarchy of the organizations, I think as Ankur was sort of alluding to, the hippos, or the highest paid person in the organization, no longer can have power to make the decisions about what you're doing strategically for what problems you're going to solve. You need to look for that across the organization. And you have your own independent motivation for that because you want to be successful. And you have to recognize that you have blind spots because you haven't been there. You don't know what those people need. So being able to democratize that across the organization and pull those people into your innovation process is really kind of the raw material that feeds my team from a patent innovation standpoint. And that way, I know we're going to get into sort of metrics later, but we know that those are key indicators to figure out whether our strategy is right, not just whether our IP system is meeting our internal targets. So inclusion is inherent to success, in my view.
Thanks, Idris. I want to come back and spend a few minutes to something that Ankur touched upon, the eye rolling. About a year ago, when I had the privilege of moderating a similar panel, one of the questions I asked was, how long is this DI movement going to last? Is this the new normal? And the panel at that time thought, this is the new normal, we're moving forward and not going to look back. Progress has been made. Since then, we have had the Supreme Court case involving Harvard and University of North Carolina, Title VI case. But many companies are now looking at possible Title VII liabilities. Over 20 states have now enacted or are considering enacting state laws against DI initiatives. And the media has dubbed this the great rollback. If you look at the tech cuts, Zoom has wiped out its DEI department entirely. So you guys are in the trenches looking at this. Are you feeling the heat?
Would you, I'm sure we could all talk
Yeah.
about that.
Of course, go ahead.
Who would you like to have?
Since you're looking at me the most intently, I will say you, Ankur.
So you're of course right. We are seeing, pushback. There's significant challenges that we are facing. Those of us who work in the DEI space, myself, I didn't mention this earlier. I am the chair of our DE&I council in the legal division at Freddie Mac. So I try to stay closely attuned to what's going on outside, but we even internally we see the sort of the pushback. I don't know that I'm the only one who's coined this phrase, but I think I came up with independently that DEI is a 3-letter acronym, but a 4-letter word currently. And if someone else has come up with that first, I apologize. I swear I didn't. And you're free to use that in your speech. But I think we have to be cognizant of that in how we approach DE&I efforts these days. We have to be cognizant of how it's going to be perceived outside of our bubble. Those of us who are preaching to the choir, we understand the importance of it, right? If we're going outside of that, especially in the current political environment, you have to be cognizant of how your efforts, how your marketing, how your publicity of programs, which you may have done in the past, could be misconstrued and used against your company. And so you need to be, I think, more sensitive to how your messaging. I don't think that means that you need to do less. I think you still need to make the efforts, and I think maybe do some more under the radar type efforts. And then you also need to more substantively take a critical look at some of your efforts to make sure they would withstand legal scrutiny were it to be faced with that. And I think that's more obvious. We're not talking about affirmative action here, right? We're not talking about quotas. We're talking about, as someone alluded to earlier, a rising tide lifts all boats. We focusing, and I could go on about the benefits of DE&I efforts, even in the today's political landscape. But I think the main thing is that you have to be sensitive about how it's going to come across and how it could be used against.
So even a year ago, if you were to say, we want to increase diversity in our organization, we need more Black women. And you made that as, in some way, part of your hiring strategy. That seemed almost like a good thing. These days, it would be red flagged. It would be, your corporate counsel and your outside counsel will probably say, don't do that. Fly under the radar, have diversity task forces, but don't do something that is so overtly racially discriminatory. And in this case, it's positive discrimination. Is this what you're seeing as well?
Sure. So I also lead up our legal team, DE&I council. We have 2 committees within. One focuses on internal advancing of DE&I. The other one focuses on our relationships with our law firm partners and a mutual growth together with our law firm partners. And unfortunately, I'm not surprised. Is it frustrating? Yes. But the way my approach to DE&I my whole life has been, you have to come at it like a salesperson, because I've always had to sell it and the benefits. So that hasn't changed. You have to make sure everything you're doing is complying with existing law and how law may be extrapolated. And I think for a lot of, I guess, minorities too, you've had the experience of people, you make 2 steps forward, you're not surprised that somebody's going to come and try to push you back. And so you just, again, going back to Judge Michel's comment about thinking outside of the box. 1, make sure, do an audit, make sure you're doing that what you're doing is legal, but how are we thinking outside of the box to still effectuate the change? That requires, by intentionality, that requires creating actionable plans. Another thing that Judge Michel mentioned was the lag, the progress, how the pace is kind of glacial. We found success in making time-bound plans. You may not be able to achieve the results in that time, but the actions that you've set out, you have a time amount, the efforts need to be done, because this isn't our day job, right? To advance DE&I. And so when you create those that accountability, you will see some results. And then I mentioned at the beginning that humility coming back and measuring it. But when you have measurable results, that helps you sell to your leadership that we should be doing this, finding allies, which is people of all different backgrounds, right? To champion it. But that's kind of the global strategy. No, not surprised. Make sure what you're doing is legal. You don't have to, I don't think you have to change. We haven't had to change. We've looked at what we're doing. It's required reflection. It's also required utilizing our allies to have that voice so that we can keep having the change that we've seen in the past few years.
Daryl, can I just interject a different sort of philosophical point? These leaders in industry are emphasizing how it's good business, and there's ample literature establishing that it's good business, and that therefore profit-seeking companies in their own self-interest should be promoting DEI types of goals. But I'd like to suggest that I agree with that. I think it's well established. I mean, even the military has been a leader in a form of DE&I for decades. The broader philosophical point is that America has been built since its inception on a lot of things, and not all were good, but on opportunity, on trying to maximize opportunity for our citizens. And that means all of our citizens. So I think that leaders in public institutions, in private corporations, in foundations, universities, everywhere, need to not only focus on, what helps the bottom line, but what broadens opportunity for all citizens.
Thanks. Idris, now you're looking at me intently.
Well,
Go ahead.
I think I was going to maybe say a few things. So one is, while I think a lot has been done to sort of impair the structures around driving DE&I in organizations, I don't know of any aspect of the law that has changed my level of agency to make decisions on my own. So I hire a lot of minority and women-owned law firms without having a lot of those structures in place. I know at ACPC, I'm looking at Suzanne constantly. There was a discussion about NAMWOLF and different diversity or certifications around different diversity profiles, I guess, for law firms and different institutions or vendors. But I don't know that you have to be on a vendor diversity list for me just to decide I'm going to hire you. So we do that all the time. And when it comes to the organization, free speech still exists. So I'm glad to ask all kinds of questions across the organization around who are you working with, why, where do they come from, what are their backgrounds, what is the size of the organization? Are we just creating new opportunities for people who might not have had those opportunities in the past? And I think that is embedded in our culture. So, I think to a large extent, while there were systems in place that sort of created the status quo that we're trying to reach a level of equity around and maybe course correct, I think there's a lot that can be done without necessarily having the infrastructure we'd like to have. We still have our own agency to be able to execute against what we think is right.
Great. Talking about building infrastructure, DEI, of course, is about creating pipelines. And one of the responses by some companies that are facing a concern about lawsuits if they are overtly trying to help underrepresented groups is to look at alternative educational qualifications. So Delta, for example, used to have a 4-year college degree requirement before you could qualify as being a pilot. They are now waiving that. They're looking at other matrices. In fact, even in the law, they're looking at alternatives to the bar exam as a means of admitting underrepresented groups, broadening the field. Do you see that as a viable way of moving forward, pushing the agenda of DEI without getting caught up in what's going on with this great pushback.
I'm getting looks again. I'm glad to tackle it. At this point, I definitely have to use a disclaimer that my colleague Idris used before, that I'm speaking for myself and not my company, because I have thoughts.
That's when you know it's getting interesting.
So these are definitely my personal thoughts. I think it's a both and. I think that, you know, creating a broader pool is a net positive. I also think that there's a narrative that casting a broader net is also lowering the bar. And I'm careful about efforts that might be fodder to support that argument. My focus when it comes to DEI internal to Estée Lauder, where I was one of the I've been there a while. I was one of the co-founders of our Black ERG. I was a professional development chair for a number of years, and now I'm actually a board advisor on a broader program that we do. But it's always around professional development. My argument is that this is untapped talent that's excellent, that we're overlooking. And I want that cohort to be able to display that. So I don't think that the bar necessarily needs to be lower. What I think is the bar, access is an issue. So there needs to be accessibility and support around giving people the opportunity to be able to achieve. I think a lot, you know, there are a lot of social barriers around that. Some of this is around accessible childcare. There's, you know, there's all kinds of, that's a whole other panel, I suppose. But access to education, access to good education, access to, you know, support systems. I was actually at a board meeting. I'm totally going off topic, but it was at a board meeting for my daughter's school system, where I objected to the concept of giving kindergartners homework. Because if you do, and you have a single parent at home or someone at home who doesn't speak English as a first language, a kindergartner doesn't get to learn. And I just think that that's a social injustice that happens out of the gate. And that kid is going to be disadvantaged long-term. So it's not about potential. It's not even about, you know, lowering the bar at that point. I think access to equal opportunity happens a lot earlier in the system, and increasing the pipeline there is important. But once you're at the point where we want to be able to display that we're just as capable as everybody else, I push the bar even higher. I want them to exceed expectations.
Claire, I know you spoke passionately about broadening the pipeline during our call. Why don't you share with folks in the room some of the thoughts that you shared with us?
Sure. So in addition to serving as the head of our legal department, DE&I Council, I also sit on the company-wide DE&I Council that has representatives from each of the various organizations. And Under Armour also has a DE&I team whose day job in and out is to advance the strategy. And they lead the council. We have executive leadership too on the company-wide council, just to make sure it's like the infrastructure to have best practices, make sure things are consistent, give us the platform to learn from each other, talk about pain points, successes, and we're moving really quickly because this has really generated a lot of speed since 2020, as a lot of programs have, and we're weathering the storm of the more recent attacks. So I think that one of the ways you can get around it is by looking at, again, individualizing your approach. So we talked about marketing. Do you have campaigns that are inclusive in terms of the people? Are you celebrating? Are you making your employees feel heard? Do they have the proper involved, like they have a say? And I mean, that goes from innovative ideas, what's our process there, to fabrics that we're putting in our products, but also to make sure that our campaigns are authentic, especially towards the target consumer. And so the different organizations are refining the ways that we create creative content, and adding processes that facilitate the creativity. So in terms of broadening the pipeline, one initiative that crossed the different organizations at my company is called the UA Combine. So we had we've scaled it too. We started a pilot program with one HBCU, and now it's across HBCUs for undergrad. They have a problem that they apply to be in the program, then it's a week-long program where they work on teams, and here's a real problem that Under Armour would like to solve. What are your proposals? And then they present that to a panel of executives. They get to network with people at Under Armour. I don't know, I think it's a pretty creative way to give people exposure, professional development opportunity, and then something they can use regardless. We can't hire all of them, but something they can use in their professional development application process to get jobs later on too, and networking. That's one cool example.
Do you have any idea of, just as a rough percentage, how many do you hire?
From our intern program.
Yeah.
So we do have, I do not know off the top of my head, but the directive is if you are part of our rookie program from the undergraduate level, the directive to employees is we expect that if these interns are qualified and they have a good summer, you have a spot for them. So there's a lot of intentionality there. One thing we're doing with the legal department is we're on our second year of a combined internship for the summer for law students with Finnegan. And yeah, it's been a wonderful partnership. And
Is this an exclusive partnership?
well, this one is. Yeah, yes, so the associate will split their time between Finnegan and Under Armour. So they get a first-year associate will get the experience working in-house and at a law firm. And again, so we're trying to think creatively. We are taking both a macro, but then a micro hand-holding approach. Whose life can we impact? Because, I mean, I think if we all think about our career trajectories, that champion, that interaction, that somebody sponsoring you or connecting you with someone, that exposure, all of these elements, you're not sure what will help Claire get to that level, but if the more we can layer on, we're going to be impacting. But we've also seen, we do have specific, again, I'm all about my success stories because it helps me sell the efforts that we're doing, but we do have mentoring. Like, so I keep track of keep tabs of what our legal department's doing to mentor as well. So it's taken a lot of planning, it's taken input, surveys, talking, conversations, but we really have a multi-pronged approach across organizations at our company to try to, what I've been more recently call it, instead of a pipeline, a pathway, because it's a little bit broader. Like, we're trying to broaden the pathway to the legal profession.
Thanks. In fact, that's great, because I was going to say Chip's intervention reminded me that I should save time for Q&A. So, Estée.
No,
It was over 100, and went through them. It was. I remember starting off interviews of the final slate of candidates being like, I'm just impressed by you. Like, all of, I'm so impressed, and really, I wish we could have taken them all, right? So we're looking as a legal department, there is interest. This is going to be more of an IP litigation focused internship, but other, like our privacy team, we have different subject matter teams that have outside counsel. They're like, oh, we can, how did you do this? And so they're asking me, coming, Claire, how can we support this? How can we have an internship like this? So, I mean, I think.
And just for the two of you, how do people apply for this program?
Personal statement, yeah. Yeah. Oh, wow.
Was this news for you?
Yeah. I
You get the
know.
scoop here first.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's the diversity of candidates, even within their stories. It was very compelling and just energizing, right? Every time you can expand somebody else's opportunity who has demonstrated a work ethic, like, I don't know, that's one of my favorite things to do.
I read about.
Right, yeah.
Any other questions, comments? Yeah, sure.
Playing to them videos that are not really help you connect with something you don't really think about necessarily.
Thanks. Anyone else? Yes. But one of my greatest takeaways from a video game that I played when I was a teenager was the price of peace is eternal vigilance. And I think that sums up exactly what you had so eloquently described. So thank you. Idris?
This question,
Yes. Quick follow-up question for you, Suzanne, is do you see, however, that this might chill more firms from wanting to sign on to things like the diversity pledge and publicly identifying themselves with a position that they may later be sued for? Thanks. Did any of you want to jump?
I was just gonna say.
All of you want to jump in, okay.
I know. One thing that's helped, is when you're talking about, you just like, when you have that culture already, but our employee resource group have almost challenged our company. Like, they're not gonna let our company, even if they wanted to, they're not gonna let them go backward in the progress. But to some extent, the company gave them that platform and voice. So it is very interesting, but that's something that's hopeful.
You know, Daryl, one of the things that plagues many movements in the United States is weak-kneed lawyers. Suzanne talks about risk management. The default attitude of a lawyer advising a company is don't do it. If there's any risk at all, don't do it. Partly for personal reasons, because if you do it and somebody hurts your reputation or sues you, I'm going to get blamed. So I'm going to tell you don't do it. And leaders and mid-level people too need to not let lawyers dictate company decisions to them, because they're always going to be hyper risk avoiding. So you don't let the lawyers decide, let the company decide, considering all the factors that companies normally consider. And you know, if you have $150, you can sue anybody and you can claim anything. It doesn't mean that the suit has any merit or will progress beyond step one. So even the threat of a lawsuit shouldn't be taken as something to engender terror and stop in your tracks. It may even be beneficial in the long run. I'm not advising people to take imprudent risks, but one of the ways the law develops is when there's a different viewpoint brought to bear, and there's a new lawsuit, and then some level of court, even the Supreme Court, may clarify or adjust what people thought they were ordering in the initial case. So some of these suits actually could be beneficial in terms of developing the law, and even for a company reputation, it isn't necessarily the kiss of death to be sued by some idiot saying that you're violating the Constitution because you're trying to help people, you're trying to help your company, you're trying to have more diversity, more opportunity. You know, who's against more opportunity?
Thanks.
I don't
Yep.
think I'm going out on a limb ever by saying I agree with Judge Michel. Right. You know, obviously you have to be willing to take some level of risk if you believe that what your company is doing is the right thing. And I think a lot of us probably feel that, you know, still today, there's a huge value perspective associated with D&I. I mean, you want to have, you know, strong D&I programs at your company because you want to have that inclusive culture and you want to attract and retain really good talent. And I think of it as a competitive advantage. Companies that have that can attract, diverse talent and can retain them better than companies that do not. And for all the reasons we've already talked about, right? It's important to have that in your company for innovation, for profitability, for a number of reasons, for building a workplace culture where you do have mentors and you can advance as a person. So I do think that, we need to keep doing what we're doing. I talked about messaging, we don't want to open up Pandora's boxes or cans of worms or whatever the analogy is unnecessarily, but you do want to keep, I think, working at it.
Now, let me ask you this. So Freddie Mac is a minority-owned majority company.
Well, it's a majority minority company,
Right.
and we're roughly 50% gender equity as well.
Does it make it easier for you then compared to, say, Idris or Claire in trying to push the DEI agenda?
I don't know that it is, because I think we're all aligned in terms of what we feel is the.
Personally, but as a company.
I don't know how to answer that. It's certainly, I can speak for myself and for my company, even though my comments are my own. But I know, having been there quite a while, that we do have a strong culture of diversity, equity, and inclusion at Freddie Mac. And it's not, I'm not going out on a limb when I talk about how it is important for us, and we view it as a competitive advantage to have a strong DEI program.
Can I just add this, is that I think something that I've noticed is a change from even when I was younger, is that companies have been sort of animated with personhood in a way that's different today than when I was growing up. When I was growing up, no one talked about what Coca-Cola thought about something, about anything. You were just a Coke or Pepsi person because you liked one or the other. Now that's changed, and it's driven by both consumers and, to Ankur's point, by the talent market, because people go into each of those engagements sort of, again, with that animated sort of framing of, is this a company whose values I agree with? Are they blue or red? Whatever it might be. When you're inside any organization, you start to realize that it's just as, frankly, divided as the rest of society. So there are people on both sides of the aisle when it comes to politics. I have friends who will buy from Home Depot or Lowe's, but not one or the other because of where they fall on some sort of list in terms of political spectrum. But I've also worked with someone before who said that, global warming doesn't exist because we have air conditioning. So for many different reasons, we're not close. But it's just
Common sense being one of them.
there's that. But that being said, I think that's something that companies are struggling with, is that, you have to try to do what's right. You should be trying to do what's right, but you have a lot of different stakeholder interests that just didn't exist anymore, or didn't exist before. So you're juggling all of this. So to Judge Michel's point, when you're trying to solve against the legal risk, one of the unique value orientations to an organization that good in-house counsel have, it's like a Michael Porter thing, is being able to take all of that into context, which is the legal risk may not be the risk you need to focus on right now. It may be this other risk that's really mission critical to your organization, and you should be informed to be able to advise your business holistically on all those fronts.
Thanks. We're nearly at time, but did I see a hand at the back? Yes. Great, thanks. I hope Esther Lim heard that. Life-changing conference. We have just 1 minute, and if I have indulgence for another extra minute, so each of them can have 30 seconds. One thought that folks should be left with, including anything that we're supposed to have covered but didn't cover. Idris.
On the spot with this question. I was just using my time to sort of maybe respond to this question because I can't respond to that one so quickly. But I think you're absolutely right. So access to that information is critically important. I'm a product of that too. So I went to Howard undergrad, pre-med, but I was taken under the wing by Dr. Oladapo Bakari, who's now the dean of the chemistry department, who had a patent internship that he wanted to send me to. And I had no plans, so I said, yes, let's do that. Long story short, it led to this. He came to my wedding. So we're very close even to today. But what I make sure I do is when we do this conference, typically, this time I don't get to do it, we also have a gathering at Howard undergrad to do exactly that. For the undergrad students in STEM and engineering, I'll just do sort of a fireside chat to let them know that this opportunity exists for this pathway that they're not otherwise usually exposed to.
Thanks, Idris. Judge Michel?
I think America is over-lawyered and over-judged, and that we depend too much on the courts to solve every problem. The problems we're talking about here today are better and more broadly and more permanently solved by individual action within companies and other institutions than by judges and juries in binary dispute between warring parties. There's a place for suit. Sometimes they're unavoidable, but I think that progress will be much greater if everyone takes the chance to do what they can do in their place rather than talking about lawsuits or waiting for the courts to fix everything.
Thanks. Ankur?
So I'll go back to the soundbite. DE&I these days, 3-letter acronym, 4-letter word, right? But you don't want to you don't want to lose sight of what's important. We talked about our companies and the value that we place on DE&I efforts, and so you want to just keep your eye on the ball and just try to, as Claire is saying, you have to market, you have to sell the program, you have to explain that a DE&I is not a zero-sum game. It's not, if someone's winning, someone else is losing. No, it's actually the whole organization is being lifted up and everyone in it.
Thanks. Right.
Don't be discouraged. I think, yeah, that's my message. Keep on fighting and be malleable when find another way and be creative.
And on that hopeful note, join me in thanking the panel.